My name is Gabriela Livanos, and I am the very proud Vice President of UNCA Psychology Club. Once again, we're extremely happy to have you here for Dr. Keith Payne's lecture on implicit bias, the psychology of ordinary prejudice in everyday lives. Dr. Payne is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is our mansion, as I like to say, of a neighbor here in the UNC school system. It is there where he is also the social psychology program director. He earned his PhD in social psychology from the Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, in 2002. His research interests include the study of automatic thoughts and feelings with a focus on stereotyping, prejudice, and social attitudes. And this likely explains why his lab studies how inequality shapes the human mind. And he also wanted us to include a little fun fact about him so that you can kind of get to know him personally. Fun fact, he grew up in Kentucky, so people tell him that he has a southern accent which comes out when he is either very tired or very enthusiastic about something. So if you hear his southern accent start to come out throughout this evening, you'll know that he is passionate about this material. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome him and give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Gabriella, and thank you all for coming, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. And if I step away from the microphone, can you hear me in the back? Yep. Not as well. Okay, I'll try to stay close to the microphone then. I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about implicit bias. This is a term you may have heard in a lot of different contexts. Over the last year or so, the idea of implicit bias has gained a lot of recognition in the popular press and in our sort of public dialogue. But the increased awareness hasn't necessarily kept pace with the level of understanding of what implicit bias really means, what it is, what it's not, and what the science behind it really says. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on tonight. During the presidential debates, I don't know if you all caught this, but Hillary Clinton said something about implicit bias. And those of us who study implicit bias went, oh my God, Hillary Clinton said implicit bias in a presidential debate. And then a second later we went, oh my God, Hillary Clinton said implicit bias in a presidential debate. And then the next day, Mike Pence was arguing with her about it and saying, well, don't accuse police officers of being racist like that. And it became suddenly something that we've been studying in the lab and in the field for 20, 25 years, it became this politicized thing overnight. And so what I want to do today is focus on what the research really tells us about implicit bias, what it is. We'll talk about how it works, meaning how it operates to affect the decisions of ordinary people in everyday life. Why it's not just another term for racism, and based on what we know about it from the research, look at some pointers for what we might be able to do about it to reduce its harmful impact in people's decision making. So we know that racial attitudes in America have been changing steadily for decades. One source of evidence that people often look at is survey data. What I'm showing you here is a few questions from various polls and surveys that have asked representative samples of Americans the same question in the same way repeatedly over many years. So, for example, in the question of how many people say it's okay to discriminate on the basis of race when selling a home, back in 1972, it was a majority of Americans said, yes, it's fine to discriminate in terms of who you're selling your home to or who's moving into the neighborhood. By 2012, that was greatly diminished, not at zero, but about 28% said that was okay. Other questions like, would people oppose having a close relative marry a black person? This is a survey of white Americans. Same sort of trend. As early as 1990, a majority of white Americans said yes, they would oppose that. By 2012, it was down in the 20s. For blatantly prejudiced statements, like the idea that whites are more hardworking than black people, a majority of white Americans agreed with that as recently as the 1990s. So even though these numbers aren't close to zero yet, there's this clear downward trajectory in the percentage of Americans who are willing to endorse openly biased statements like that. And this kind of evidence has been used as evidence of a very optimistic trend. So many people have argued, many social scientists have argued over the years that, well, even though we're not free of prejudice yet, the trends are in the right direction. And if you can sort of extrapolate this line, then give us a couple of more decades and we'll have taken care of this whole racism thing, right? So that's one kind of data. Based on this kind of data, most Americans have a very optimistic view of how we as a country are doing with racial prejudice. So what I'm showing you here is data from another survey that asked white and black Americans to judge how much of a problem anti-black bias and anti-white bias are on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 is the worst. And they asked them, so this study was done just a few years ago, and they said, all right, well, how do you think things were back in the 1950s? All right, how bad do you think things were in the 1960s, 1970s, and so forth? So this line is indicating how people view how bad anti-black bias is and how bad anti-white bias is by decade. What I'm showing you here is the responses of black Americans. And so basically what you see here is folks saying, well, in the 1950s, anti-black bias was horrible. It was almost a 10 out of 10 in terms of the severity of the problem. And it's gradually gone down. Anti-white bias, say this sample of African Americans, has started low and has remained low over time. Okay. That's very different than the views of white Americans in the same survey. White Americans agreed that in the 1950s, anti-black bias was terrible, but they see much more of a precipitous decline over time, and white Americans' perception is that as anti-black bias has declined, anti-white bias has increased, to the point where by the 2000s, the average white American was saying that anti-white bias is a more severe problem in America than anti-black bias. That's a striking opinion to me. So this is people's sort of perception of what's going on around them. We can look at other data, more objective data, things like income and wealth gaps, which are dramatic and consistent over the decades. So this is the net worth or wealth of white and black Americans on average from the 80s through 2013. And you can see it's more or less constant. In 2013, the average white family owned 13 times the wealth of the average black family in America. And if you look at these kind of trends, certainly isn't consistent with that sort of optimistic, rosy story, right? But this kind of data is always ambiguous. I mean, it's objective in the sense that it's actual money, not people's opinions. But it's unclear what drives these kinds of statistics. Some people look at this and say, look, there's rampant discrimination. That's causing this disparity. But other people look at this same data and say, well, maybe whites are working harder than blacks. And other people look at this data and say, well, even if there's no discrimination, maybe there's no discrimination today, and this is just sort of the after effects of previous generations of discrimination. If people's parents didn't go to college, they're less likely to go to college, and so on. Right? So data like this can document that there are disparities, but they can't really tell us why. For that, we have to look at present-day behavior. So one kind of study that provides us with that kind of data are field experiments. I'm going to tell you about one field experiment from the sociologist Diva Pager, published in 2013. And what she did for this field experiment was she had a team of research assistants, experimenters or testers, and they went and applied to actual jobs in actual want ads. This one was done, I believe, in the Milwaukee metro area. Now, the people hiring for these jobs didn't know they were in a study. They just had people applying for their jobs. And Pager's team had bogus resumes so that they were all equivalent on average. They were equally qualified people applying for the jobs, but half of the testers were white and half of the testers were black. And they applied to 350 jobs, I believe it was. And they would have a white tester and a black tester about a week apart apply to the same jobs. And they would see how often those two people got a call back from handing in that resume. Right? So job qualifications are equated. They also had, they dressed similarly. They had scripts to say the same thing when they turned in their resumes, their job applications. And so the only thing varying is the race of the person handing in that application. They also varied one other thing, though. And that was, you know how a lot of job applications will have a box where it says, check here if you've been convicted of a crime? In half of the cases, they ticked that box. And in half the cases, they did not. And this provided a way of seeing, sort of scaling, how severe interracial discrimination might be by comparing it to another kind of discrimination that we expect to be there based on people's actual behavior. So what I'm showing you here is the proportion of applicants who received a callback, whites only, and you can see that checking that box that says they've been convicted of a crime cut their callback rate about in half, from about 34% to about 16%. All right, so that's not terribly surprising. But look what happened when the black applicants did the exact same thing. Black applicants without a criminal record were called back less than 15% of the time. And those with a prison record almost never got a call back. And the striking thing about this data is that the penalty, if you want to think of it that way, for just being a black applicant is as big or slightly bigger than the penalty people pay, that white people pay, for having a criminal history. Now, how can both of these scenarios be true? How can it be the case that things are getting better year over year and we're on this upward slope toward egalitarian values, and yet black applicants are getting called back at half the rate of white applicants when they hand in resumes that have the exact same qualifications? So this wasn't just a one-off study. Versions of this study have been replicated in New York, in Atlanta, and in Chicago, I believe, with very similar results. About half the callback rates when African Americans turn in these resumes. So how can both of these be true? Well, there are a number of different answers to that question. I'm going to focus on one of them that social psychologists have looked at, which is based on the idea that what people say in surveys isn't necessarily what they're acting on. And what they're acting on often has more to do with the thoughts and feelings that come spontaneously to mind, rather than what they tell a surveyor. So to give you a feel for this, rather than just talking about it, I'm going to do a quick little demonstration, if you wouldn't mind bearing with me. I'm going to show you 5 pictures in a row, and then I'm going to show you a word fragment, the beginning of a word that has a blank, and I just want you to say the first word that comes to mind as a completion to that, okay? You can just say it all out loud. Most people will all say the same thing, all right? So here's 5 pictures, then a word fragment. First word? Terrier. Great. So you may not have known that these are all varieties of terriers. They are. But what each of these pictures is doing is activating what we call a node in a semantic network, right? Each of these is associated with the category of dogs, and the category of terriers is linked to that. And every time I show you one example that fits in that category, it makes other pieces of information or knowledge associated with that category more likely to come to mind. It makes them more accessible, right? So I'm going to show you one more version of this demonstration. I'm going to do the same exact thing, 5 pictures, then a word fragment, and think about the first word that comes to mind. Here we go. You don't have to say it.
Terrific.
So you don't have to say it, but I know what you were thinking, all except you. And to know what you were thinking, I don't have to know anything about your values or your politics, right? All I need to know is that you live in the same culture that I live in, and that our culture has terrorism associated with our categories of Muslim men, right? And the interesting thing about that is that it doesn't matter whether you believe that that's true. These associations, once some part of the category is activated, they come to mind involuntarily. In other words, you don't have to sit and rack your brain to think, terror, what? I don't know. Once I've shown you other images that are part of this category, the idea sort of leaps to mind as soon as you have this ambiguous stimulus, TER. Sort of like when you start to type in a search term in Google and Google suggests a completion for that term. That's the way these automatic associations work. They sort of suggest trains of thought that you might follow up on. Come to mind involuntarily. The other thing is these associations come to mind regardless of whether you agree with them or disagree with them, like having them or dislike having them. Right? It doesn't matter if you believe Muslim men are terrorists or not. Simply having that category in your knowledge base is enough to make those thoughts come to mind. And the reason that that matters is that we know from lots of research that whatever thoughts come to mind in the moment can shape our actions in various ways. And we're going to look at some specific examples of ways that those automatic associations can shape our behaviors. So implicit bias is based on these automatic associations that come to mind. And what I want to emphasize is that implicit bias is not just a euphemism for racism. Right? So whereas as lay people, we tend to think of prejudice or racism as a property of bad people with bad character and bad values, some kind of aberrant personality. What this research suggests is that implicit bias is a side effect of normal cognitive processes. In other words, we always think with the aid of categories, and because of that, we engage in categorization. We also make generalizations from those categories. We connect our thoughts to associations from those categories. So just like if you're a kid learning about a new category of birds, as soon as a new example of birds, as soon as you understand that this new animal is a bird, then you'll make certain generalizations, like that it has wings and it flies and it lays eggs and all these sorts of things. Now, occasionally that will lead to errors, right? So they might miscategorize an ostrich or something, think it flies. The difference, I mean, at a cognitive level, it's basically the same process going on here. It's just that nobody gets hurt if you overgeneralize about an ostrich. Right? But whenever it's social categories we're talking about, the same processes can lead to discriminatory behavior in which people are harmed. Another way to think about this in terms of distinguishing it, the idea of implicit bias from just another way of saying, oh, that's racism. Implicit bias is found in children as young as 6 years old at levels identical to that of adults. So, in response to one of the studies that showed this early on, Newsweek ran a cover of the magazine that had this angelic-looking little child on the front, and the subtle and sophisticated headline, "Is your baby racist?" You remember this? Yeah. And I mean, the absurdity of that idea, that your baby is a racist, points out that just because little children show implicit biases when tested at the same rate that adults do, does that mean we should hold little children accountable, or should we rethink what's going on in the minds of adults as well? Okay. So one of the ways that implicit bias affects people's behavior is that those associations, once they've come to mind, they change our perception of sensory evidence. I'm showing you here two examples of news broadcasts in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In one, the caption says, "A young man walks through," and this is not my caption, this was the AP's caption. "A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store." The other one, the two young white people, it says, "Two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store." These poor young people doing whatever it takes to survive, right? Now, this is just anecdotal. Who knows what else was differing between these two situations. But there have been a number of studies run that systematically do a very similar thing. So for example, one famous study from Sager and Schofield back in the 80s showed participants a video, two versions of a video, in which two little boys were playing. And they started out playing happily, and then they started getting a little rowdy, as little children sometimes tend to do. And then at one point, one child sort of shoves the other child in a bit more of an aggressive way, where it's not clear whether they're still playing now or are they starting to get into a fight. And that's the point at which the video stops. But there were two versions. One of the children was white and one of the children was black. And in one version, it's the white child who does the ambiguous shoving, and in the other one, it's the black child who does the ambiguous shoving. And they just showed people these two videos, one video or the other. If you were a participant in this study, you'd only see one and wouldn't know that there was anybody else watching a different video. And they asked, okay, now, is that kid still playing, or is he starting a fight? Is he being aggressive? And as you might suspect, when it was the black child doing the shoving, the audience thought he was starting a fight. When it was the white child doing the shoving, the audience thought he was still playing. Now, the interesting thing about that is not just that people were biased, but that if you asked people, as they did in the study, why do you think that child was being aggressive? All they could point to is, well, I just watched the video. I saw it with my own eyes. From the first person perspective, that's all we have to go on, right? The participants in that study don't know that there's another control condition. All they can say is, I saw it with my own eyes. From the experimenter's perspective, or from the perspective of somebody reading about this from the outside, we know that there are different conditions, and so we can tell that people are being biased. But from the internal observer's perspective, they have been taken for a ride by their stereotypes. And they can't tell you anything about it other than what they saw. That's one way that stereotypes influence us. Here's another way. I like this study because it makes the point that implicit bias is not some cold, calculated thing. We're biased implicitly even when it makes no sense whatsoever. So hurricanes with female names kill more people. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how hurricanes are named. Since the 1970s, the National Weather Service has been naming hurricanes in a systematic and randomized way. So they alternate male and female names, and they go through the alphabet, A, B, C, D. And so that list is drawn up ahead of time before the storms ever come. So it's not like they see a really big storm and go, oh, well, let's call that one Brutus or something, right? So this creates a naturalistic experiment in which names are randomly assigned to hurricanes. So Sharon Shavit and colleagues did a systematic analysis of hurricanes ever since the National Weather Service started naming them that way, and looked at the number of people who were killed in each one. And what they found, well, first of all, they also separated them into high damage storms and low damage storms. That's important because if it's a weak hurricane, it's not going to kill anybody anyway. It doesn't have any potential to cause deaths. It's the high-powered hurricanes that have the potential to do a lot of damage. Okay, so, and they found, so they had students code the names of each one from very feminine to very masculine, and they looked at the average number of people killed in each storm. And so, as you can see here, many more people were killed per storm for the more feminine names. Anybody know why? Care to take a guess? Okay, it's a good point, Hurricane Katrina. They actually removed Katrina because she was such an outlier, because Katrina killed so many people. So this data is without Katrina in it, actually. That's a good point, though. So the reason seems to be that whenever it's a female name, people don't evacuate. Yeah, exactly. How much damage could something named Katrina do anyway? Really? So the more masculine the name, the more people actually get out when they tell them to evacuate. Now this makes absolutely no sense, but it makes sense in light of, it makes no sense from a rational perspective, but it makes sense in light of what we know about automatic associations and implicit bias, right? So another way that implicit bias changes perceptions is illustrated in this study. They took iPods. This study was done in 2009 and published in 2013. So slightly used iPods were a hot item at the time. And they put them on eBay, and they either showed the top version here or the bottom version, same iPod, same poses, but the average bids were higher whenever it was a white hand holding the iPod than a black hand holding the iPod. Again, these are real bids by people who didn't know they were in an experiment. I don't know what else to say about that. So, implicit bias also changes perceptions of other things in a white person's hand versus a black person's hand. I was in graduate school in the late 90s when Amadou Diallo, shown here on the cover of Time, was shot and killed by 4 NYPD undercover officers. Now, most of you all are too young to remember the Diallo case, but you've certainly seen other cases in the news of unarmed black men being shot and accusations of racial bias and so forth. This was one of the early cases that really made national headlines. Before this point, the term racial profiling wasn't sort of a everyday word in people's vocabulary. This was really a big event in 1999. There was a lot of controversy, a lot of protests, laws were passed, and so forth. And so what happened in this case was that Diallo was standing outside of his apartment in the Bronx, and 4 plainclothes police officers were on patrol. They were looking for a specific, a suspect in a rape case on a very vague description. The description was basically a male, either black or Hispanic. So they were looking for somebody, a male who was not white in the Bronx. And so they came upon Amadou Diallo and they said, stop. Diallo reacted by reaching into his pocket and pulling out something. And when he did that, one of the officers yelled gun, and all 4 officers opened fire. So Diallo was shot and killed immediately. Only when the shooting stopped did they realize that what was in his hand was just his wallet. Right? So it's not clear whether Diallo was trying to show them Diallo was an immigrant. It's not clear whether he was trying to show them some form of ID. They were plain clothes. He may have thought he was being mugged. It's not clear. But he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and that's what happened. So the question, I mean, obviously it was an error. But the question everybody was asking is, well, what would have happened if Diallo had been white instead of black? Right? Real life doesn't have any control groups like the experiments we're talking about, right? So nobody will ever know, and I'm not going to try to infer what was in the mind of these 4 police officers. But we can answer a more general question. The question that was asked of the jurors in the trial when those police officers went to trial. As the New York Times phrased it, the question for the jury becomes, would a reasonable police officer in that circumstance come to the same kind of decision making? So the question is not whether they were wrong or right. It's clear that they were wrong. But it's the reasonable person test. Could a reasonable person make the same kind of mistake, given the situation they were in, what they knew at the time? So laboratory experiments can tell us something about this sort of general question. What would a reasonable person do if the reasonable person, or if the average person is a reasonable person? We can say, well, what would I do if I was in that situation? What does the average test subject do? And so we designed a series of studies that asked people to complete a computer task. A very simple computer task. It's like the most boring video game ever. On each trial of the task, participants saw a face that was either a white person or a black person. That disappeared, and then they would see an item that was either a gun or a hand tool. And then it disappears and is just replaced by a fuzzy black and white mask. And they were just told, press one button if you see a gun, press the other button if you see a hand tool. Right? And in one version of this study, people had all the time that they wanted. And in the other version, they had to respond in under a half second to sort of mimic the time pressure that a police officer might be under when having to make a life and death decision when the other person might be armed. And so the basic data that we found in this study, and that's been replicated dozens and dozens of times since, is that when people are responding quickly, when they're in that rushed condition, they're more likely to make an error by mistaking a harmless object for a gun whenever it's associated with a black face than a white face. They're also significantly more likely to make the other kind of error, calling a gun a harmless object, whenever it's been preceded by a white face than a black face. Now, this didn't happen when they were responding at a very slow pace because they got them all right. These are not invisible, right? They could see them and they could respond appropriately. But even though they were visible, when responding under time pressure, people started making mistakes, and those mistakes weren't random. They were systematically biased by race. Right? The other thing that's worth noting here is that it doesn't matter whether you're looking at black subjects or white subjects. They show roughly the same amount of bias because we're all raised in the same culture that has the same stereotypes that associate black men with criminality. So lots of follow-up studies. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it doesn't matter whether subjects are warned to avoid bias. Like some studies only work because the subjects don't know that they're being tested or they don't know what sneaky things you're up to. This isn't the case here. You can tell people this is a test of racial bias. Don't be biased by race, but it doesn't matter. You can tell subjects they're going to be held accountable for their responses, and we're going to share how they do with other people. It doesn't matter. In fact, it actually makes people more biased to the extent that they're worried about looking biased. The studies that I was just telling you about were with sort of general population or with college students. Other studies have been done more recently looking at actual police officers, and the finding is that police officers show a similar bias to civilians, although it is smaller in magnitude. So, and it's associated with how much firearms training the officers have. So more training is associated with smaller bias, which is perhaps an optimistic note about the potential for training to mitigate some of these kinds of biases. So how does this laboratory data match up with real-world data? Well, we don't have great data yet. Many police departments don't report data on shootings. Many of them do so voluntarily and selectively, but there are some databases beginning to track these sorts of things. Here's a recent study that looked at all of the data that's available, and you can see if it's, let's see, where it's completely white, there's no data, but shades of yellow to dark red indicate the frequency of police shootings by race. And overall, unarmed black suspects are 3.5 times more likely to be shot by police than unarmed white suspects. More data is coming in on this on just about a daily basis, so these conclusions might be changing. But this study didn't just look at what the disparity is, but it also looked at what factors it's associated with. And they looked at 4 in particular. One is the overall crime rate. You might think that there's more racial bias whenever in places where the crime rate is higher. They also looked at the race-specific crime rate. In other words, are there disparities in who's committing the crimes? You might think that, well, police officers are just responding to differential base rates based on race in their everyday experience. So in areas where African Americans commit more of the crimes, a larger proportion of the crimes, you might see a greater bias among the police officers. They also looked at the percentage of African Americans in the population, which is sort of a proxy for how much interracial contact whites have with African Americans. And they also looked at the level of income inequality at the county level. And what they found is that neither the crime rate nor the race-specific crime rate was actually associated with the degree of racial disparity in police shootings, which is puzzling if you thought the police officers were just responding to sort of objective contingencies in their environment. Instead, what predicted the degree of bias was the percentage of African Americans in the population and the degree of income inequality. So these are markers not of differential base rates, but of social conflicts. Right? The data seems to suggest, and it's still very early days, but it seems to suggest that we see the same kinds of disparities driven by in-group, out-group biases that we see in the lab. One other kind of data on this I want to mention briefly. You've probably heard about New York City's stop and frisk program, in which police officers stop and frisk people, search them for basically any suspicion. It's actually on hold right now because of a federal court ruling. But we got a hold of the data from the stop and frisk program, more than 500,000 cases in which the police officers recorded basic information about who they stopped. And so what I'm showing you here is the percentage of people stopped who are African American, right? So overall, you know, if people were being stopped with no racial disparity, you'd see that being around 14%, or maybe higher in New York, it will be the percentage of African Americans in the local population, right? But it's nowhere near that. It's around 60% for the adults, going up strikingly to 90% for 11 and 12-year-olds. So just to be clear, it's not that 90% of people stopped are 11 and 12. It's that of the people who are, say, 11 years old who were stopped, almost all of them were African American, right? And the reason we actually predicted this ahead of time, the reason is that adolescents are very ambiguous in terms of whether you should treat them like adults or like children, right? Adults, it's clear. If they're doing something that looks suspicious, you hold them responsible. With 11-year-olds, if they're doing something that looks weird, are they just being a kid? Or are they doing something nefarious, right? And we know all of the data that I've shown you so far suggests that implicit bias influences our judgments primarily when it's an ambiguous case, where we don't know what the right answer is. Either you're responding too fast to think carefully, or you don't know who to hire, right? So adolescents are the most ambiguous case, and that's where we see the greatest racial disparity. Oh, I've got the stat there, 26% in New York are black. So that's what the base rate would be if there were no disparity. All right. So we've been talking about how race can bias judgments, especially when it's ambiguous. We can go beyond just items like guns and tools to generalize that as a way of measuring implicit bias in general. And that's what we've done in a number of studies. We get rid of the guns and just replace them with an ambiguous target object. So here I'm showing you a Chinese pictograph. In other studies, we use fractal images. In other studies, we use abstract paintings. It doesn't really matter as long as it's not something that everybody thinks is great or everybody thinks is awful. If it's ambiguous and people don't know exactly what to think about it or how to feel about it, then our social categories and our implicit biases can bias that judgment. So in this paradigm, we call it the affect misattribution procedure because people misattribute what they're feeling toward the face to what they think about that ambiguous target image. So in this task, we tell people, ignore the face. The face is there to bias you. Don't fall for it. Just tell us whether you think that Chinese pictograph is pleasant or unpleasant. Right? And so we know from other studies, if you put like disgusting cockroach pictures or spider pictures in the, as the first image, people overwhelmingly say that pictograph is terrible. Right? And so across dozens of trials like this, if somebody is consistently saying the pictographs are terrible whenever they happen to be randomly paired with a black face or a white face, we know that people are having a negative reaction to it. Right? And this provides a very reliable and valid way of measuring individual differences in implicit bias. Notice we're not asking people how they feel about African Americans or white people. We're just asking them to judge the pictographs. But by observing their behavior over dozens or hundreds of trials, we can tell what kind of affective reaction that they're having toward those prime pictures. So I'll just tell you about one study that illustrates this kind of thing. So in a large study, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here in the interest of time. We find that in the 2008 presidential election, we measured this 2 months ahead of time, and we find that although both Obama voters and people who eventually became McCain voters showed more pleasant responses for white faces than black faces, it was much greater for people who eventually voted for McCain. And that was true after controlling for things like whether people were liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, and what they actually said explicitly their racial attitudes were. Okay. So before we wrap up, I want to do a little demonstration with you, lest you look at these cases and think, well, these terrible police officers, they're so biased, or these terrible hiring managers in Diva Pager's field study, look how biased they are. Implicit bias is not the study of racism in other people. Implicit bias is the study of the biases in our own minds, right? So I'm going to do a quick demonstration with you to let you experience that for yourself. This is the implicit association test. Many of you may be familiar with it. But we're going to do a live version of it. And so the idea here is I'm going to show you a series of words, and I'm going to click through them pretty quickly from slide to slide. And I'm going to ask you guys to clap either one side or the other. So you can use your legs or your chair or your laptop. Well, be gentle to the laptops, but so clap on the left side if it's a word related to safety, and it's going to be one of these 5 words. Clap on the right side if it's a word related to crime. It's going to be one of these 5 words. All right, everybody with me? Okay. So we're going to go as quickly as you can without making too many mistakes. All right. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, go. All right, good. You're getting the hang of it. Now we're going to do the same thing, but it's a little bit different. Now you're going to clap on the left side if it's a name that's typical for white people, and you're going to clap on the right side if it's a name that's more typical for black people. All right? And you'll have little reminders at the top so you don't forget. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now we're going to make it a little harder, and we're going to clap on the right side if it's either a black person, name typical of black people, or a crime-related word, and clap on the left side if it's a name typical of white people or a word related to safety. All right, and again, you'll have reminders on the top so you won't forget. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So, good job. Now you've mastered 2 at once. Now we're going to do it again, but now we're going to switch those categories, all right? So it's clap on the right side if it's related to crime or white-related names. Clap on the left side if it's related to safety or black typical names. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Falling apart a little. Come on, we're almost done. You can do it. All right. So let me mention that when I show this task to undergraduates for the first time, they become expert methodologists. They say, well, maybe the order in which you did that matters. If we had done it in the other order, it would have a different result. At which point I say, well, when you do this in the lab with the real experiment, you counterbalance the order in it so the order doesn't turn out to matter. And people say, well, but maybe it's easier to do things on the right if I'm right-handed, and it's harder to do things on the left. And no, it's not that. If we do it in the lab, we counterbalance what's on the left and what's on the right and that sort of thing. So everybody can be forgiven for looking for good reasons that last block was so much harder for most people than the previous blocks. But the fact is that in study after study, on average, Americans have a much harder time doing the version in which white names are paired with crime and black names are paired with safety than the version in which, what did I say? The other way around. So we can talk at the end about what exactly these kinds of biases mean, but I wanted you to experience it for yourself as a reminder that when we look at the behavior of people in these studies, it's all too easy to say, shame on those biased people, right? But if implicit bias is really about side effects of ordinary cognition, the way we all think with the aid of categories, then it means that as long as we've got those categories, we're all vulnerable to those biases. Okay, so it's difficult to think about both the idea that these are biases and they could lead to discrimination, and discrimination is wrong, and on the other hand, I have these biases too. And that tension is always there with implicit bias. And it's illustrated, for me, by these 2 letters I received after my very first publication, which was about that weapon misidentification task that I was showing you. When the publication came out, it got a little bit of coverage in news media, and so a number of people wrote to me. 2 of them in particular stuck out for me. One of them was from somebody describing himself as a retired police officer, and he said, you should be ashamed of yourself because you're implying that police officers are racist. And the other letter I got said, it was from somebody who described himself as a civil rights activist. And he said, you should be ashamed of yourself. By calling these things automatic and implicit, you're implying that we should let police officers off the hook for biased behavior instead of holding them accountable, instead of holding them responsible. So I felt ashamed of myself, but I wasn't sure why, right? And this is the bind that implicit bias puts us in. It's hard to hold these 2 things in mind at the same time, that because of the way that the human mind works, we're biased. And that's wrong, right, to actually be biased and discriminate against people. So we're not going to resolve this at a philosophical level here tonight, but what we can do is talk a little bit about what we know from the literature in terms of concrete steps for reducing bias in people's behavior. So what can we do about it? Well, first of all, we know a little bit about what doesn't work, just from the studies I've already told you about. Good intentions aren't enough, right? Having a well-meaning person or group of people making decisions about who to hire or whatever the case may be isn't enough. Because implicit bias, by definition, is bias counter to one's intentions. One important thing that many organizations are moving to is having more diversity in decision-making bodies. If you have a committee deciding who to hire or who to admit for college or whatever the case may be, you want diversity on that decision-making body. So that is important, but it's not because non-white people on those committees are going to be somehow unbiased. We've seen again and again in the studies I showed you and in other ones that women can show gender biases just like men can. People of color can show racial biases just like white people can. So it's not, the reason for having diverse decision-making bodies is because we want a diversity of perspectives, but it's not because having diverse people on the committee somehow makes them immune to bias, right? We're all vulnerable to these kind of biases. One of the things that we really need is proactive strategies that structure the environment well. What does that mean? One of the themes throughout the studies I've shown you is that under conditions of ambiguity, where it's not clear exactly what you're looking at or it's not clear exactly what the right thing to do is, that's where implicit bias has the greatest potential to influence us. If somebody is like off the charts qualified, we don't discriminate against them. If somebody is off the charts unqualified, we probably don't discriminate. We just don't hire them regardless of who they are. But it's in that gray area in the middle where they have some strengths and some weaknesses where we see a lot of discrimination in hiring. Usually that's where most decisions in real life take place, in that messy middle gray area. But one of the things that we can do is decide ahead of time what are the factors that are important. So how do we do these things? Well, one thing we can do, very obviously, is blind reviews. In other words, when I'm grading papers from my students, I try to do it in such a way that, that I don't see the name before I see their paper, right? In studies of blind reviewing in various different kinds of settings, turns out that just not knowing the social category of the person you're judging makes a big difference. So when symphony orchestras moved from non-blind reviews, where somebody would come and play the instrument on the stage right in front of a panel of judges, when they just added literally a screen behind which people would audition, there was a 50% increase in the selection of women for symphony jobs. The scientific journal Behavioral Ecology a number of years ago switched from reviews in which you could see the name of the person submitting the article to a blind review in which neither the reviewer nor the author could see who it was, and that led to a 33% increase in publications by female authors in biology. So we know this works, and there are many cases in which we can do this pretty easily, and there's probably no excuse not to be doing this on a routine basis. You can't do this with everything, right? You can't do blind review if you have a defendant in court, for example, right? But there are lots of cases in which this is very easily practical. Another thing that is less obvious is the importance of focused attention. So I've talked about a number of studies in which people were more biased whenever they were either rushed or distracted or didn't know exactly what they were supposed to be doing. One reason is that implicit bias, because it comes to mind automatically, it doesn't take a lot of thought. Whenever we're tired or rushed or distracted, we tend to fall back on whatever ideas have come spontaneously to mind. So lots of studies have shown if you distract people by making them multitask, for example, they show greater discrimination in tasks like deciding who to hire. Now that's really weird if you think about implicit bias or prejudice as being something about the character of a person, right? Why would somebody's character be different when they're texting versus when they're not, right? But if you think about it as a side effect of normal cognitive processes, we basically just fall back on shortcuts whenever we can't think very carefully, right? So one way to think about this is if you wouldn't drive, don't make important decisions, right? We know you shouldn't multitask while you're driving. Lots of people think they're good multitaskers. They're all wrong. The science could not be clearer that, if you devote 10% of your attention to some other task, it harms your performance on that other thing by 10%. Right? So that's also the case in terms of making decisions in an unbiased way. If you're doing it under distraction, you're inviting bias into the process. The other thing we can do is pre-commit to what criteria are important. In study after study, when people show implicit bias and then you ask them why they did that, they sort of point to whatever reason is salient, right? If they discriminated against somebody and because of implicit bias, and then you query them afterwards and you say, why didn't you hire them? They'll find whatever weakness on that resume would justify not hiring them, right? Because they don't know why they did what they did. They just know that it seemed not very good, or this candidate seemed better than the other one. Same thing with sort of stop and frisk data. Who counts as suspicious is a subjective judgment. Now, you could always point to something that seems suspicious after the fact. So if we're making decisions about something like hiring or admissions or whatever the case may be, it's very easy to pre-commit to what's important ahead of time. How important is the GPA? How important is somebody's work experience? How important are these other things? And if you do that, it prevents this sort of post hoc rationalization by just being able to get it out on the table ahead of time. What are the important factors for the judgment? All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I'm happy to take whatever questions you have, and we'll continue the conversation. So thank you all.
So I have a question about the slide that showed the number of police shootings, I think. It was a map of the entire United States, and if I remember correctly, it was showing the number of shootings where a black unarmed person was shot by police?
Yeah, it was. If it was white, we have no data.
No data.
And then the shade from yellow to dark red showed the disparity. So the darker the red, the higher the white to black to white disparity. On average, that was 3.5 times, but in some places it was as high as 12 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
That's the dark red.
What struck me about the map is that it looked like Asheville was on there in dark red. But I didn't see larger cities in North Carolina like Charlotte and Raleigh were not there. But so I guess my question is, that just means we don't have the data from those cities, not necessarily that happens more often in Asheville.
That's right. So if there's no data, so police departments in most states report voluntarily. And so it probably means if Asheville's data is there and other one in Charlotte's or whoever is not, it means that Asheville's police department is better about actually reporting their data.
I appreciate that you gave us some concrete steps to working on this. Here's a question. What is it that we can do and working with children on the elementary level all the way up so that we can start eliminating some of this by the time they hit adulthood?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the striking things about the data with children that shows that they do have implicit biases comparable to adults is that we know that children are amazing sponges of the culture around them. They learn language, they learn all sorts of things just by soaking it up from their environment. And so I'll give you sort of a long-term pie in the sky answer and a short-term answer. And the long-term answer is that children are going to reflect whatever they see around them, right? And so I think the only way to not make children have these biases is to change the culture they're immersed in. But on a short-term basis, I think for children, just like adults, the best goal, in my opinion, is not to change the associations in their mind so much as to change the setting in which people make decisions. I think, although it's possible that we can change people's associations, the data suggests that everything that has been tried, and we've tried some of these ourselves in my lab, interventions that change people's implicit bias, it's on the one hand really easy to change them. All you got to do is have a really positive, energetic African-American experimenter in the room running the experiment, and people's implicit biases shift because that likable person is a salient example of the category for them. And then if they walk out and down the hall to another lab, shifts right back, right? So it's immediately reflecting what they're seeing around them in their culture. So rather than thinking of these as long-term attitudes that kids learn as children and carry with them throughout the rest of their lives, I think it's better to think of these as they're just shining a mirror at what's around them. And so if you want to protect them from being biased in their relationships with friends, for example, it's more about setting up a good structured play environment, for example. So in general, I think that's a more productive way to go, to structure the environment well rather than trying to change the person.
Hello again.
Hi.
So, let's see if we can lower this a little bit. Struggles of being barely 5 feet off the ground. So, I have taken like most people in this room, who are also probably psychology majors, I have taken the racially biased, I think it's called IAT, that identification test. I've taken it twice now, and the major criticism I always seem to hear about it that I also have wondered about is obviously, as we all experience, you have to match people of Caucasian descent and people with those names or pictures of those people with positive, virtuous, moral terminology before you have to match people of African American descent with concepts of crime and theft and just more negative things. So my question for you is, what do you think of and how do you respond to the criticism that presentation of matching, as in what items you have to match first before others, if that would shift? If we had to match white people with negative terms first before matching black people with negative terms,
Right.
how would that change?
So, this is what I was referring to a little bit in terms of the methodology part. It differs in a demonstration like this versus what you would do in an actual laboratory experiment, right? So, in the lab, you would typically counterbalance that so that half of the subjects get one order first, but then half of the subjects get the other order first. And so whatever bias is introduced by that order effect gets sort of canceled out by averaging. But the other thing, more generally, the IAT is the best known measure of implicit bias. And like any measure, it's got strengths and it's got weaknesses. Because it's so well known because of the Project Implicit website and things like that, people tend to equate the IAT with implicit bias. And one reason I focused on a lot of different methodologies today, like the affect misattribution procedure, like the weapon misidentification task, like all these other experiments, is to try to separate the idea of implicit bias, which could be measured using all sorts of different tasks, from the IAT, which is just sort of the most well-known example. So the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of measures are complementary to each other. So I think we have to look across the broad field to get a good feel for how implicit bias is working, as opposed to putting all of our eggs in one basket with one measure.
Hello? Okay. So, are you familiar with research into trainings such as those like mindfulness that alter associations in a trend similar to that of police firearm training, like had been mentioned earlier?
Yeah. So there is a little bit of research on both mindfulness and other kinds of training that aim to change people's associations. We've engaged in a little bit of training work ourselves. We've tried to change the associations of that medical residents have to Latino patients that they're working with. And so what that data usually shows is that short-term effects, but not long-term effects. And I don't think that's because people are snapping back to their true selves. I think what's happening is that people are walking outside of the training context and emerging back into our culture. And so I'm beginning to think more and more about these things as not really measures of people at all, just that people are the conduits for the associations in the culture. So what we're measuring here, sort of like the wisdom of crowds sort of effect, but it's the bias of crowds, that each person is picking up, reflecting a little bit of the bias that's in the culture. So you can think of it as these measures are probably better measures of the situation or the cultural context than of the person themselves.
Okay. Do you know if in this research, kind of this ongoing research, it's a longitudinal in basis, and if it does kind of hit some of those different areas and maybe account for that kind of shifting culture of it?
Yeah, there's a little bit of longitudinal research just emerging recently. Here's one complication, and I remember I told you that 6-year-olds show the same level of bias that adults do. And when people hear that, they immediately think, wow, children are learning these things really young and carrying them with them for the rest of their lives. That's possible, except the test-retest correlation for implicit tests. In other words, if I give you a test and give you the same test a month later, they're almost uncorrelated. They're very weakly correlated across a month. Surely they're not going to be correlated across 30 years. Right? So it can't be that people are picking up these biases as children and carrying them with them forever. And this is, I think, what the longitudinal studies are showing, that when people sort of snap back to whatever the mean is, whatever the average is, it's because they're not snapping back to something about themselves. They're just sort of reverting to the mean of the environment. Sure.
Hello. Do you know about any tests that have been done with implicit association abroad or in other cultures?
Yeah, good question. So I focused mostly on American studies, but lots of studies have been done, mainly with the implicit association test, but also with other kinds of measures as well around the world. And it gets a little tricky, the interpretation, because what something like race means in one country might make no sense whatsoever in another country, right? But I think the level at which we can interpret these things in a meaningful way is to say, well, in whatever culture we're looking at, what's the dominant group? What's the dominant majority high status group? And then what's the minority group that's lower status that you're focusing on? And it seems to be pretty universal that whatever the dominant majority group is evaluated more positively than whatever the minority or low status groups are, right? But you have to define that in a culturally specific way.
Hello. So typically as we age, you see the level of stubbornness rise as people tend to get older, as well as considering the fact in the last 100 years there's been a lot of touchy conflicts going on with, segregation of African Americans and such like that. We definitely see a very big difference between older people now than we might in like 30, 50, 70 years. So what I'm wondering is, with our generation, how we're trying to be, progressive and try and fix these issues that have constantly been going on in the past 100 or so years, where do you see our generation ending up in 30 or 50 or 70 years when our stubbornness levels perhaps rise?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think you're right that these things change on a generational scale, not like on a scale of weeks or months or whatever. In terms of whether there's sort of an age effect based on stubbornness, as you say, or whatever the case, whatever sort of rigidity that might accompany age, there is data showing that, on average, older adults show more implicit bias than younger adults. But the surprising thing is, if you separate that test performance into two, it's fairly complicated how you do this, but take my word for it, I guess. If you can separate people's scores on implicit tests into two different components. One of them is what their automatic association is with the category, and the other one is basically how good they are at doing the task, how fast and accurate they are at just doing a speeded categorization task, right? If you separate those two components, it turns out that older adults and younger adults don't show any difference in the automatic associations that they have to the category of whites and African Americans. Where older adults and younger adults differ is that younger adults are just better at doing those speeded categorization computer tasks, right? So what looks like higher prejudice among older people because of some cohort effect turns out to be a cognitive decline effect that just means people are slower and less accurate, right? Whether that's good news or bad news depends on your perspective, I suppose. But the data doesn't seem to be consistent with what I think is a very intuitive position, which is that people brought up in a older time, decades ago, are going to carry those biases with them forever. That doesn't seem to be the case.
If there was a way to reduce the bias in the media, do you think there would be a reduction of implicit bias in the general population?
Yeah, another great question. I think probably yes. I think media exposure is one of the major pathways by which stereotypes in the culture get expressed. And there's a lot of research showing that there are correlations between, for example, how often local news shows the mugshots of African American criminals and doesn't show the mugshots of white criminals, for example, and the degree of implicit bias in that area. So I think we don't know for sure, but I think it's smart money is on betting that, if you change media portrayals, you're probably going to change what people are reflecting back at you.
Can implicit bias affect voting behavior particularly? And if so, does the political climate influence that effect?
Yeah, so implicit bias definitely predicts voting behavior. And I was rushing through it a little bit there, but the one study I showed you with the affect misattribution procedure for Obama voters and McCain voters, that was an example in which people with greater implicit bias, implicit racial bias, were less likely to vote for Obama. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that implicit bias can easily turn into explicit bias. And one of the things that we found that flips whether people feel entitled to overtly express and endorse their implicit bias as something that they really believe versus saying, well, that just was a stereotypical thought that comes to mind, but it doesn't mean anything. I don't really believe that. Is if an authority figure says, it's okay, whatever you think, it's okay to be biased, and nobody's going to judge you for that. So we've done a number of studies in which we basically have the experimenter as the authority figures tell people, you might have felt uncomfortable feelings toward African Americans in that implicit task. That's okay. Your attitudes are valid, and it's, nobody's going to say anything bad about you if you believe that. And then we give them an explicit questionnaire. And people who are high in implicit bias, who have had an authority figure validate that bias and say, that's okay, that's good, you should express whatever you think, they now endorse much higher levels of explicit racism. So looking around at what's going on today in terms of having people in positions of authority validate people's biases as justified is, I think, worrying on many levels. I don't think it's necessarily going to change their implicit bias, but I think it's going to be a factor that makes many more people feel justified and entitled to claim those as valid, real beliefs that are true in the world, as opposed to just their own silly stereotypes and biases. Yeah.
Follow-up question.
Sure.
Do you think that could explain the recent popularity of populist candidates in Western democracies, having these authority figures validate and kind of having that thought process?
I don't know if it explains the popularity of populist candidates or whether populist candidates explain the popularity of more overt expression of bias recently. That's the way I've been thinking about it, that having candidates that say, look, you don't have to be, quote, politically correct. You can say whatever offensive thing you want, is a way of basically changing social norms. And social norms are the reason that survey data has shown that downward slope, like I was showing you at the very beginning, whereas implicit bias hasn't necessarily. And so if we change social norms because of our public discourse, then it's not going to change people's implicit bias. What it's going to do is give them permission to be explicitly biased.
Hi, my friend's here, so I don't sound stupid. I don't know, for emotional support. Anyways, you got it. So, in Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, she breaks up black kids who grow up in a white context, and the white context would be their immediate surroundings. So like the school they go to being predominantly white, obviously America would be a white context, but that we all live in. But I was wondering if you knew if there were any differences in students, children or adults who grow up or live in communities that are mostly people who look like them, like black people who live in black communities, having an implicit bias that differs from the national average.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a bit of research in that area. So there's sort of two main kinds of evidence about that. One is looking at people's actual implicit test performance in a task in which they're sort of they're seeing black and white faces, and they're getting either rewards or shocks, and it turns out that people are faster to learn fear responses to black faces than to white faces. But that depends on the degree of contact that those subjects have. These are white subjects. The degree of interracial contact they have and the closeness of that contact. So not just sort of knowing some people who are black, but the best predictor is for people who have actually had a close dating relationship interracial dating relationship, those folks don't show the differential bias in terms of fear learning. So that's one kind of data about that that has to do with the intimacy of an interpersonal relationship. The other kind of data is data that goes back to the 1940s. Kenneth and Mamie Clark did a famous series of studies starting in the 40s and even in the 30s that actually had an impact. It was cited in Brown versus the Board of Education, a Supreme Court case that overturned legal segregation. Their studies were of small children in schools, and what they would do is sort of like an early forerunner of implicit tests. With little kids, they would just show them 2 dolls or 2 puppets that were identical, except for one was a black kid and one was a white kid puppet, right? And so they would just ask them straightforward questions like, which one looks nice, right? Which one would you rather play with? Now, for white children, they showed a pro-white bias. The white kids wanted to play with the white dolls. For black children, whether they showed a pro-white bias or a pro-black bias in terms of which dolls they selected depended on whether they were in an integrated or a segregated school. Now there, integrated versus segregated, it's not by choice, right? So segregated schools, you would have black children who are in all black schools, but these are also under-resourced and lower SES schools and things like that, right? So those children actually showed a pro-white bias, right? The black children who were getting that cultural message seemed to prefer the white dolls, whereas black children who were in integrated schools preferred to play with the black doll, just like the white children preferred to play with the white doll. So it's a little bit complicated, like which is the bias, right? But it definitely speaks to the idea that more integrated and diverse social settings changes the way that black children in particular think about their own social categories.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you seen any research that looks at implicit biases with the Latino community?
Yeah, so a little bit. It's less common than research aimed at racial attitudes toward African Americans. The challenge is that for a lot of these tasks, they use pictures of people that are flashed very briefly. And in our lab, we've tried to do some of this, and it turns out that if you flash white and Latino pictures very briefly, a lot of times white subjects can't distinguish like who's Latino and who's white, as well as they can from quickly flashed photos of white faces and black faces. So that's just sort of a boring technical reason that's limited the research. But there has been some research done using verbal labels instead of pictures, and as you might expect, there's a high degree of pro-white bias whenever it's, or anti-Latino bias. Very little research that I'm aware of has looked at whether that actually predicts discriminatory outcomes. And I think that's just because of the smaller number of studies that have been done. All right, so maybe this will be the last question because I think we're supposed to wrap up by 8:30 and we're just about there.
Sorry if I phrase this weird, English isn't my first language, but in your studies and teaching, are you using black synonymously with African American? Like, do they mean the same thing to you?
Well, the literature is actually quite mixed in terms of what terminology people use. And this is something that changes with time. So even since in the 15 years I've been publishing, the verbal labels, both in terms of what gets published in journals and what makes sense to subjects, is changing. So I think it's a moving target. And so I think it's going to depend on the particular context and the particular year we're looking at, right? So A lot of this stuff is dictated by conventions like, APA style and things that drive college students nuts when writing research papers. But yeah, so in my talk today, I've been using African American and Black mostly interchangeably. Some studies make finer grained distinctions than that, and some of them don't. Did you have a thought about how those might come apart in terms of implicit bias?
Well, maybe not, someone might not say like, have a more specific bias towards one or the other, but not all Black people are from Africa. And
Right.
I think it's harmful to use that interchangeably because then it's assumed and it's creating the wrong message.
Yeah. Thank you. All right.
Let's give Dr. Van Hand. Thank you very much.
Thanks.